Hello and welcome to the Red Room. Tonight we are facing the final boss of internet shitlords, the RPG Pundit. Hello RPG Pundit, welcome to the Red Room.
Hi, nice to be here.
Nice to have you. So, how are you?
I'm doing well, and how are you?
Yeah, we're great.
Yeah, not great. We're never great.
Yeah.
We're good.
Oh, I see. Well, you're Portuguese, right? So I guess
Exactly.
Yes. We have to complain a bit.
Yes. Normally
all
when
the
ask a
people that think things are great went to Brazil or something like that.
exactly when you ask a Portuguese how are things, you are in the risk of him telling all his maladies and sicknesses and complaints.
Well,
Yes.
see, Canadians, when you ask how are you, you say not bad, right? And if you're an American, if an American asks a Canadian, how are you doing? And you go, oh, not bad. They're like, oh, what's wrong? You know, but the Canadian, not bad means they're okay, right? So it's a variation of optimism.
You're never great, of course. You're not. Whoa, I'm very good. No, it's okay.
Well, I was trying to pretend. I know I'm talking to persons who are not Portuguese, so I said great. I don't feel great. I feel awful. Now I'm being honest. Okay. So let's start this. Okay. Your new product there, it's a new old school companion anthology of adventures, right?
Yes, that's right. The Old School Companion 2 Medieval Authentic Adventures.
So these are
320-page books.
17 scenarios, right?
No, there's 26 scenarios.
26, okay.
There's 17 slightly longer ones and 9 shorter ones. So it's got a huge range.
These were published before, right? In RPGPundit Presents?
This is a compilation of all of my RPGPundit Presents medieval adventures all together in and in a book, because this is the first time they've been published in print, because before that they were only available in PDF.
Yeah, it's different because there are some people who prefer to have their source books in paper, right?
Yeah, of course.
I am one of them.
And also just the convenience of having it all in one place.
Yeah, of course. You don't do bundles, you edit a new book, right? Something like that.
Sorry?
Instead of doing a PDF bundle, you publish a book.
Oh yeah, no, I publish a compilation. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it makes sense. The fact that it's on print, it's much better.
Yeah. Well, to me, it almost, nowadays PDFs are books, right? But
yeah,
I'm old enough that to me it doesn't really count unless there's a physical book as well, right? So
yeah, you don't have the book unless you really have the book.
I agree with that. I'm also old enough for that.
I mean, I read PDFs all the time, right? Like constantly. I have no problem reading PDFs, but it's still that bias as somebody who was born before the internet is still existing in me.
Yeah, I understand perfectly. Like I only I'm game mastering something when I have the book in the physical format. If I have the PDF, okay, it's interesting, I can read it, but well, it's not the same. There's always something missing.
Yeah, sometimes a PDF is convenient for when you have to look something up on the fly, right? So it's
yeah, nowadays
if it's got a good index or whatever, or good search function.
Nowadays, while playing online, it's usually it's even more useful because, well, it's better to have the thing on the computer than paper, but it still has the same problem when you're not online.
I prefer to read books, especially role plays on the PDF, because sometimes the books are big, so it's easier. But I don't feel like I have the book exactly unless I really have the book. It's different.
Yeah, for sure.
But before that one, there was this big tome here, Invisible College,
That's right, the Invisible College.
very big tome, as we can see there, about
432 pages.
yes, well, it's heavy. We can listen to the heaviness. Okay, so an overview of the Invisible College. What is the Invisible College?
So the Invisible College is an occult modern conspiracy OSR RPG, right? So it's set in the modern era. It's like in our world, presumed. Well, I mean, it was written in 2021, so I guess you can presume 2021, but it's really, you know, in the present year is what it's presumed to be set in. And it involves, it's also like many of my books, it's a historically authentic book. It just happens to be set in the present because it deals with a number of secret societies that are engaged in a secret war with each other, an occult war, a magical war, to determine the evolution or the spiritual evolution of humanity. And these groups have, you know, are moving behind all of the kind of sources of influence and power in the world, and also, you know, fighting each other in kind of more in supernatural contexts and environments too. Now, these groups in the book that are described in the book are the reason I say it's historically authentic is because they're all groups that either actually existed or actually existed with a different name, just to avoid insulting groups that still exist, right?
For example, the one in the title was real.
That's right. The Invisible College was a real. Well, it was. You know, the Invisible College was never technically an organization. It was a movement. It's more like, you know, it's not like the Rotarians or something, which are a group, right? It's like punk, which was a movement. Mm-hmm. It was a 17th century movement that came out of Rosicrucianism, another group that was once real as a movement. And specifically in England, it promoted what the historian Francis Yates calls the Rosicrucian Enlightenment, which is to say, we usually think of the Age of Enlightenment in Europe to have begun in the early 18th century at the time of, you know, Sir Isaac Newton. But actually the real moment where Enlightenment thinking has its birth is around the 1630s, is right in the midst of the English Civil War, and when there was still the wars of religion in Europe, where you have this group of thinkers who are spiritually inclined that look to create a universal philosophy, and a philosophy of universalism, as in the concept of what they called the brotherhood of man and the fatherhood of God, so that their main position was freedom of conscience and therefore freedom of speech, and also freedom of religion, right, as a result of that. So they wanted to say, well, you know, there's fundamentally, if there's one deity, whatever it is, then it must be a universal deity that any man, however they worship, are subject to a single God. And if that's true, then all men, regardless of their religious differences, are brothers. This was happening when hundreds of thousands of people were being murdered because of the difference between, you know, guys that believe that confession is a sacrament and guys that don't, right? Like these tiny theological arguments, you know. But these people got to that philosophy because of their supernatural or occult studies. They were one of the biggest influences on the Invisible College was the magician John Dee, who was already dead by then, but he had been in the late 1500s the most famous occult figure in the world, or at least in the Western world, and had at the same time been a proponent of advanced humanism, you could say. He believed in the power of education. He wanted to expand knowledge throughout the world. He invented the term British Empire, actually. You know, he was also a mathematician and a cartographer who made big advances in both of those areas. So like these guys were, you know, what used to be called Renaissance men, but now they were pushing an ideology that involved having to create a change in society, both a spiritual and a political change. And that group eventually founded, in a way, two very important organizations, the Royal Society, which became the first institute of science, so to say, right? Still exists today. And the modern symbolic Freemasons, who became an organization that spread liberal values throughout the entire world via the British Empire. And so you can literally say that this group, the Invisible College, they founded the modern world, right? So this was the inspiration for the book, was that secret society in particular. And the other secret societies in the book, most of them, some of them are kind of neutral, but most of them are groups that have opposing views as to the idea of human liberation, right? That they don't believe that humanity should have individual freedom, should have spiritual liberation, and that every person should be allowed to freely do their will in order to obtain to their higher self. They think humanity has to be controlled, or it has to be destroyed, or it has to be kept in a dark age of some kind, you know. And so you're playing agents of the Invisible College who are fighting against these groups that have illiberal motives, let's say.
So up to a point, the Invisible College in this game are the good guys, and the others are the villains.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and you're by default, you're playing, I mean, the good guys in the sense that the Invisible College want their vision of a future is a future where every human being is free and with individual rights, and also where people have transcended to a different kind of spirituality that no longer is bound by by collective dogmatisms, rather. So, you know, some players, if they're very conservative, might not totally agree with the Invisible College.
They wouldn't be the good
guys. If they're very
guys.
religious to a specific denomination, then the same way that the papacy, you know, tried to abolish Freemasonry for exactly that reason, the Invisible College might not be their cup of tea. But, you know, what I tell them is, well, you could always run a Gormagan campaign, which it's another secret society in the group, which were also a real secret society, which were originally radical Catholic anti-Masons, you know, and would like to see a world where there was a return to a Catholic theocracy, you know.
So since this is based on the real secret societies and the organizations, how did you choose this one and not another one that had the potential to be the protagonists?
I see. That's a good question. Nobody asked me that before. I guess fundamentally because I kind of think I am part of the Invisible College. You know? You know, it's already known from my blog that I'm a Freemason. The Hermetic, the other thing is that the Invisible College, I talked a lot there about kind of their social political agenda, but they were also all magicians, right? They were alchemists and what you call Hermetic magicians in the Western high magic tradition, which also included things like, you know, astrology and the Kabbalah and these sorts of systems of symbolism that are part of the Western mystical canon, let's say. And that tradition, it evolved along with them and went through, you know, it was part of Freemasonry. Nowadays, most Freemasons aren't particularly occult oriented, let's say, but that's still fundamental to Freemasonry's practices. And it went over onto other orders, other groups, including the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, including the Alpha and Omega, all of these 19th century magical orders, and then through Aleister Crowley into Thelema, and via people who ripped off Crowley into things like, you know, Wicca and modern New Age philosophy. So basically anything we think of in the West today as as a Western supernatural practices, Western magical practices, is descended from that same tradition, which wasn't a tradition the Invisible College invented. They were just one step in the middle. There's this whole evolution all the way back from the time of the Greco-Egyptian interaction, right? The Alexandrian, the Hellenic culture. From that point onwards, there's this tradition of magic that kept evolving and developing in interesting ways, because of course, in the Middle Ages, that magic, which I present in Lion and Dragon, it's the same magic, right? That magic was based very deeply on a kind of a religious exercise, right? For either Christians or Jews in Europe, right? Later on, it turns into a system that is more universalist, and then after that, in modern versions, there's parts of that magical practice that are seen as, in some way, the language by which you interpret these sort of systems evolves. So once it was, at one point it was religion, then it was philosophy, and nowadays it's things like if you're trying to be kind of clever, psychology, like especially Jungian type psychology, but then also like, the language of science, which is to me very clashing, right? It's always when, whenever you hear some, Deepak Chopra type guy talk about, the quantum field of your mind or something like that, they're trying to use science to interpret this ancient tradition of Hermetic philosophy. So yeah, I would say I identify with the Invisible College. It's part of the heritage of the tradition that I'm in. And it was also, it was the moment, it's not the ones that get the most credit, because the Freemasons end up getting a lot of credit for this, but it was essentially the moment where, at least from the dawn of Christianity until today, it was the moment where magicians ended up having the most direct impact on the course of Western history, and therefore human history, for at least these last 2,000 years. So I think in a way they were the most successful occult movement of the modern West.
That's interesting, because I've read a lot of things about the cult and the secret societies and all that, and I didn't have, well, I think I have read something about the Invisible College, but I didn't remember it.
I think it's mentioned on Foucault's Pendulum by Umberto Eco, because I was rereading it a few time ago, some time ago, and I saw, oh, the Invisible College. Yes, I read it like was the third time I was reading it, and I was going to ask you about Aleister Crowley, because you start your book with a quote by him, but I was associating him more with the Satanists.
Same thing with me. Well, no, the Golden Dawn and all that, and I knew a lot of that, but not.
I didn't know it was part
of
the Invisible College, exactly.
And there's a lot of illustrations of him around here.
Yeah, let me unpack some of this. First of all, the Invisible College, like I said, it isn't very well regarded. Like people talk a lot about, say, the Freemasons, or they talk a lot about the Illuminati, for example, which were a tiny little group that did fuck all, right? It never did anything, never accomplished anything important. And so in one case, Freemasons accomplished a lot, sure. The Illuminati didn't accomplish almost anything. Both of them have a lot of fame in, let's say, popular culture, whereas the Invisible College was a movement that ends up, because it gets like replaced by Freemasonry, and it was never a coherent institution. It was like, to be a member of the Invisible College in the 1600s, rather, you just had to say you were a part of the Invisible College. Right? It was like being a punk, right? You didn't have a membership card or something like that. So it kind of faded into semi-obscurity, right? And then the people who started kind of pointing it out again were, I mean, in the context of like really erudite Freemasonry, like Freemasonic scholarship, obviously that was talked about for a long time because it's part of the origins of Freemasonry. But in the public eye, it started really with Frances Yates and her book, the Rosicrucian Enlightenment. And then later it starts showing up in other books that are talking about again, the kind of the origins of the Enlightenment world and kind of modernism, the birth of modernism. Probably one of the best books on kind of that subject as a whole is a book by Tobias Churton, which is called The Golden Builders, and it kind of tracks the whole history of the Hermetic tradition in three parts, right? Like the first part is the history of Hermeticism from the ancient world and the Middle Ages. And then the second part is the Rosicrucians and the Invisible College, which were very closely connected movements, neither of which ever were an actual institutional group. I know that today there are groups that call themselves the Rosicrucians, but none of them are the real institutions. Yeah, it's
since
not
the 90s, I think.
There is no true Rosicrucian order. The Rosicrucianism was originally a movement founded on a book, right? And then the third stage being Freemasonry and the birth of the modern world. So The Golden Builders, good book that I recommend for that. As for Aleister Crowley,
by the way, since you mentioned
sorry.
that, there isn't a bibliography, I think, in the Invisible College.
No, I was planning on doing one at one point, but we were running out of room.
Yeah, probably.
It would have had to have been either a really bad bibliography or a really huge one, if I was going to really give it proper attention. Maybe someday I'll just do that as a product or something. I'll say, here, say what you want. This is a list of books you should read.
For curious people who want to read something more about this.
Want to dig into the matter.
Yeah. I should do that, actually. That's not a bad idea.
Okay, so I was curious about that. I was
looking for... we like references. We like book references.
Yeah, I was looking for that, but no, nothing here. Yeah, but I understand it's a big book, so that would increase the page count. Yeah, okay.
So regarding Aleister Crowley, Crowley does get a lot of bad press, and one of the biggest types of bad press that he gets is this idea that he was a Satanist. He wasn't. He couldn't be a Satanist because he wasn't stupid enough to be a Satanist. You have to really be quite stupid, to be a Satanist. Even more so than you have to be a new atheist, maybe, right? I mean, like, I don't know. It's a big tie there. I mean, and there are people who are atheistic, but who are not stupid, right? But those aren't people that act like, like Dawkins was the Bible, right? And similarly, there are people who look at what the tradition of what is called the left-hand path, right? This idea of dealing in light and shadow at the same time, what the Sufis used to call the path of blame. And that was what Crowley was actually doing. His spirituality was definitely a universalist spirituality in the same tradition as that of the Golden Dawn, of the Invisible College, right? Where there was, it wasn't, a lot of people who don't think Crowley was a Satanist think, well, he had this religion called Thelema, and in Thelema you worship the Egyptian gods. No, I mean, that's ridiculously simplistic, because Thelema is his philosophy. You could call it his religion if you want, but it was not about worshiping, literally the god, with the head of a hawk. It's about looking at this universal religion founded on the universalist concepts that start with the Invisible College and really with maybe with Rosicrucians and then the Invisible College, and that continue through that tradition all the way through the Golden Dawn, which is what Crowley, when he was very young, he was a member of the Golden Dawn. So he was going with that, right? And he had perhaps an excessively transgressive side is without
like a fun guy.
Right? He was
probably too much fun.
He was a guy who was in rebellion against the world, right? And I think it was that he realized that he was in some way living in a world that wasn't ready for him.
Yeah.
Right.
And he's kind of an occult pop star.
Yeah, oh, I absolutely was, without a doubt, including the fact that in the same way that, you know, in the 1950s, Elvis Presley caused outrage among people, you know, pastors and mothers, you know, look at how he's gyrating his hips. You know, they were accusing him of dancing like a black person and this sort of thing. And that was just outrageous to them, right? And if you watch a YouTube clip of Elvis Presley in the 1950s today, there's nobody that could even understand. Like, you look at it and you say, well, how could this be offensive to anyone, right? And the thing about Crowley is that he had a perspective, he had a level of spiritual development, let's say, that went beyond the boundaries of the society that he had the luck to have been born into. You know, so he was trying to push his entire civilization, you know, to move to a different model than the one that he was in, because he thought it was oppressive, right? So he became extremely transgressive, and he wasn't trying to do this in a subtle or skillful or coy way. He was doing it by making himself intentionally outrageous in order to draw attention to certain things that he thought had to be changed. And he knew that at that, I think, well, I believe he was very clever, right? He was clearly a very intelligent person, you could tell by how the level of his writing and you know, his various other accomplishments. So I think he knew that he himself was not going to be ever given a proper chance or a proper recognition, but that this was something that would eventually, history would vindicate him. Right, and in a way,
it happened, right? He's
we're
probably
living in the age of Aleister Crowley today, right? Because Crowley believed in the 1900s, you know, as early as 1904, right? He dies in 1947. Thelema, he starts Thelema as a philosophy in 1904. So in 1910, let's say, Crowley believed in the absolute freedom of speech. He believed in the freedom of sexuality. He believed in the equality of man and woman. He believed that every person is a free and independent entity. He was in favor of drug use for spiritual attainment. He believed in the transformative power of art. You know, and he was, you know, basically a social libertine in every sense. And almost everything that he believed in was outrageous to the Edwardian people of 1910, was incredibly cool to the people of 1969, and is now just normal for the people of 2022, right? So, you know, and in fact, now in 2022, we find things that are unexpected consequences of some of these freedoms that we have not been able to deal with effectively. But that's what he really was kind of the architect of this social transformation in very important ways. And the people that he influenced were architects of that, right? Like the main intellectuals, let's say, of the 1960s movement, right? Of the 1960s hippie movement, of the psychedelic movement, the people behind the free love movement, you know, all of that sort of thing, all took their influence from Crowley, right? Timothy Leary was a huge Crowley fan, right? Ram Dass, all of these guys, well, say nothing of Robert Anton Wilson, you know, they'd all read Crowley, and he had an influence on all of them. The Beatles put him on an album cover, right? So that was, I think, his role.
We have, let me mention, I think it's fun. We have an outrageous story about Aleister Crowley here in Portugal. He came here, I think it was in the 20s. Right? Yes, he tried to kill himself. He pretended to kill himself, yes, because he had some creditors, or it was a publicity stunt, I don't know. But in the place, in Hell's Mouth, there's a plaque that says, this is the place where Aleister Crowley pretended to kill himself.
Yeah, he faked his death. It was fantastic. Yeah, I remember that story.
It's a nice place.
He was a good friend of Fernando Pessoa.
Yes,
Yeah,
exactly. He
that's
was the
it.
one that invited him here
Yeah.
because they were
Yeah, he was-
corresponding.
I think
Yes.
he helped them.
For our English listeners, because I'm, believe it or not, I think most Americans aren't up to date with
No.
Portuguese intellectuals. Fernando Pessoa was this poet and writer, a really important figure, from what I understand, in the 20th
Yes.
century for the Portuguese language, right? He was.
He
I got to admit, I haven't read much of him, but I always imagine that in some ways he's kind of like the Portuguese version of Borges,
He's groundbreaking because he did something very clever. He was also a lot in astrology. That's why I was a fan of Crowley, but he created a lot of pseudonyms. Is that the correct words? He wrote under a lot of pseudonyms, but he didn't only create them. He created all their lives and their astrological charts and the day they're going to die. So he had 4 different pseudonyms, all with different styles. One of them was like an imitation or an homage to Walt Whitman. Another was a bucolic writer. So they were all different. So he was kind of crazy.
Yeah.
Well, as a person, he's probably closer to Kafka because he was also a boring bureaucrat. But probably in other terms, he had another life beyond that one. So, well, strange person. Okay, so besides the real people and the real organizations, how much of the magic and the supernatural part of the Invisible College is based on real things, or at least supposedly?
Right. So in the Invisible College, the characters that you would play in this RPG are members of the Invisible College, presumably relatively junior members. The Invisible College is organized in a series of halls, which are like spy cells, right? So that they operate each of them fairly independently, and they have a kind of democratic process within their organization. So it's a very good structure to make for a player character party plus a couple of NPCs, right? And you generate the hall with its resources and with its connections and all those sorts of things. There's all mechanics there to help you do that. And then your character, you can play a character that in the game is called a Templar, which is like a combat focused guy that has no magic at all, but is like a specialist, like basically a secret agent, you could say, of the Invisible College. But I imagine most players will play a magician of the Invisible College, either learning the traditional magical degree training of the college, or being what's called a chaos magician, which is someone who is basically trying to learn randomly on their own. And the magic system in the Invisible College is basically, it's entirely based on the way a modern day, all the practices in there are practices that a modern day magician would either practice or know about if they were, doing modern magic. And the way that they're presented is as close as I can get in a gameable game to how a modern magician would do their magical practices. So like if I say that for a certain ritual, you need to do some certain kind of preparation, or you have to have certain kinds of objects or something like that, those are the things that a typical magician in the 21st century would use when he was doing that same ritual. And all the techniques are the most popular, the best known techniques of Western magic today, plus a few techniques that the West has stolen from Eastern magic, right? And it's, obviously in the book, the book isn't a book of magic. There's nothing actually supernatural in the book itself, nor will you learn how to be a Western magician by reading or by playing the Invisible College. But you will learn a lot.
You can summon a demon.
No, you cannot summon a demon by owning the Invisible College or reading the Invisible College. But if you own or read the Invisible College, you'll know an awful lot about Western occultism. And so when some friend of yours who's like read way too many Aleister Crowley books or Chaos Magic books starts talking to you about something, you'll be able to understand what he's talking about, and you'll be able to answer with knowing the information, right? So it's like it's not an instruction manual for practice, but it's like an encyclopedia of this is what real magicians do in the 21st century, So it's that level of authenticity, and the curriculum, for example, that the college uses is based on the curriculum of the Golden Dawn and the Argentum Astrum, which were, the two of the major magical orders of the 20th century Western occultism.
So this must have taken a long time researching. When did you start writing the game?
Well, researching it, I guess technically I've been researching it all my adult life.
Yeah.
I started practicing occultism when I was 18, but after that was mostly about just putting it together, right? Because it was actually I probably had to do more research for Dark Albion for my book based on the War of the Roses, my OSR setting book, or for Arrows of Indra, my OSR book on that's set in the epic mythological India of the Mahabharata. Because even though I had studied a lot about those topics, I wouldn't have been able to say I had a complete coverage of knowledge of it, and so there was stuff I had to look up and research for both of those books. I've had to do a ton of research for the book I'm working on right now, which is going to be about the Crusades and the Silk Road in the Middle Ages. But the Invisible College, actually, I have, my library of occult books are not on PDF. In real books is like huge, and I have it all here, and I've read it all so many times. And so the only really hard part was how to gamify it correctly, right? Like to figure out, okay, how do I make this into an OSR mechanic, right? Like, so there's this system where you have to make these magical tables, and then you do a ritual where you recite names that are generated through these magical tables of letters. And then that will allow you to summon spirits that will have certain effects, right? Or it'll allow you to receive these magical visions that will teach you moral concepts, right? Like that's even more hard, because if you're saying, well, I want to do X, like some kind of real world effect, and, so I'll do this ritual, that's something that is immediately understandable to a D&D player, right? So it's just, all I have to do is figure out what will the effect take, what will it represent mechanically, right? Like, does it give you a +2? Does it give you advantage? Does it make something just happen? Does it have a target? Does the target have a saving throw, et cetera, et cetera? But if I'm like saying, well, but there's this really important part of occultism, which is that the process of self-transformation, right? Of a person's attainment. How do I gamify that? That was the real big challenge, because like the other part is this, I use this ritual to have this spiritual trip, and on this trip I'm having this vision that is revealing things to me about myself and teaching me these universal secret truths about moral concepts that then will expand my mind, right? How do I turn that into a game mechanic? That was the really, really tough part.
Okay, so I did the wrong question. I'll try to do the right one now. How did you get into occult, and in which way? Because it seems that you are much more into it than the usual person who just likes to read a few books on occult knowledge, and that's the shit. You seem to be much more into it.
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting story, because it is really one of these things that's quite tough to believe. By the time I was starting university, and I had originally planned to go and study an education degree to be like a high school teacher, and within like 2 months, and we're telling you this was in the early 90s, right? So but even back then, within like 2 months, I'd realized that the education department was so utterly politicized and so full of nonsensical, what back then you called politically correct garbage, that I didn't want to be.
That was in the US, correct?
Yeah, I know it's in Canada,
Okay.
in Alberta. Then I said, no, I'm getting out of here, right? So I switched after like about a month and a half that I was starting my program. I switched over to history, and I ended up doing a history degree. And I wasn't sure exactly what kind of history I wanted to study. I knew that I was interested in like medieval history. I was interested in, the Renaissance, the early modern period. But it was my first year, so I had a lot of time to think about it. I was just taking general courses at the time. And I was also at that point, in probably any sense that you could classify, I was an atheist. Not this was way before Richard Dawkins and that sort of thing. So I wasn't what you would call a new atheist. So I wasn't a militant atheist that was going around proclaiming my atheism. I was simply somebody who was convinced that there was, no spiritual force in the world. There was nothing supernatural. There was no God. I was a very disappointed Catholic kid, and for a couple of years, I basically believed in nothing, and I was perfectly happy to stay that way, or so I thought. I had a friend, a guy named Dave, who was like me. Basically, I don't know if he was an atheist, but he was, I would say an agnostic. I'd never heard of him talk about spirituality or religion, and certainly nothing about the supernatural or the occult or anything like that, right? He wasn't really that kind of guy. He was very interested in politics. He was very interested in some, geek stuff, but he was not in any way somebody who was in any way interested in religion or spirituality or anything. And one day, Dave and me are walking around the kind of hipster street in the neighborhood close to the university where I was going to. He was going there too. He was doing political science, right? And then all of a sudden, we passed by this bookstore, which was like a new age bookstore. It wasn't was nothing as particularly special, right? And he suddenly stops and says, "Hey, we have to go in here." And I'm like, "We do?" And he says, "Yes, we do." And so I go, "Okay." And so I follow him in there, and I had no idea why he wanted to go in there. And he starts browsing around, and I had no idea what had called his attention, and I wasn't very interested, but I start browsing around just to keep time. I'm thinking maybe he's buying something for his aunt or something, or like there are, incense and essential oils and all that sort of things there. So I thought maybe he was getting a crystal for his mom or something, whatever, right? Because that's what I assumed that it wasn't even for him, whatever he was getting. And in fact, I don't even remember now if he actually bought anything at all, or if he just kind of wandered around the aisles. Because what I do know is that at one moment, I suddenly saw that there was like in this one table there was like a display table, had a lot of different products. My attention was suddenly drawn in this way that I cannot explain in any conscious fashion to this day. Like it was drawn like an arrow. Like suddenly there was this thing that was illuminated with this light that there wasn't a light you could see, but it was like something like a magnetic attraction. And suddenly everything else didn't matter except that on this table there was this little box, and this box turned out to be a deck of tarot cards. I had never used tarot cards in my life. I had no interest in them, and yet for some reason I was like pulled right at them, and I can't explain the mechanics of why to this day, right? I could only explain it in kind of a, if I was going to explain it, I'd have to explain it in a kind of hermetic context of saying that my algoid is my higher self, or my true will drew me to that deck of cards, right? And I said, I have to buy this. I don't know why, but I do. So I bought it, right? And I thought I was crazy even as I was doing it. But then I started, I opened it up, I read the little book that was there with the cards. I thought that was interesting. I also realized immediately that the little book was not really enough information, but it was luckily one of those little books that had just enough that I thought, okay, this isn't everything that there is. This is obviously somebody writing something really, really kind of stupid and for normal people. And so I said, I've got to do some more research here. And I went and started studying about this in like the library of this university, which I was going to, which is a top tier university, right? Like it's one of the top 100 universities in the world. So I ended up dedicating a significant amount of time in my first year of university to, or let's say the first half of my first year in university, to reading about these topics, right? So it started with tarot, but then I quickly discovered that tarot, the symbolism of the tarot was based on a combination of the symbology, the symbols that are used in astrology and in alchemy and in the Kabbalah. So I said, oh shit, I have to study that too. And I started studying that. And the more I did, the more I saw this whole thing being connected with this philosophy of universalism, with this other type of mysticism I'd never understood before. And so I started seeking it out. And before I knew it, I was starting to practice all this stuff, And then when the moment came that I actually got around to Aleister Crowley, which took a couple of months before I think I settled on him there, like that just blew my mind. When I started reading his books, it was incredible because his books are absolutely, they're even to this day, they're still the most intellectually advanced, let's say, in terms of you can see the quality because he was a Cambridge educated scholar, right? And he was writing about this stuff. And so you can tell that this is not the writing of some like housewife from Sedona, Arizona that spent her life working as a part-time bank clerk and now wants to write about her spirit guides, right? This is like sophisticated stuff touching back to the earliest of Western philosophy and all the way to the modern day. Yeah, so it really connected me so much so that I changed my my specialty within history to being the history of religion, and over the course of my undergraduate degree, I was constantly trying to maneuver myself into specializing more and more in the history of the occult, which I more or less did. So that was the moment of inspiration for me, you could say. And it was nothing that I planned. It was nothing that I ever expected. It came out of this really weird moment of this thing that happened that I can't explain for any good reason, and then it changed my life forever, because once I started practicing magic and studying magic and looking at it academically and looking at it as an experience, it was, right alongside role-playing games and pipes, it was one of the defining factors of my, of the rest of my life,
But then when you started writing role-playing games, I'm not sure because I'm not aware of where we started and what were you writing at the beginning, but I think it was fantasy, right?
Yeah. When I started writing role-playing games, I mean, I've been playing role-playing games since I was, I think, 11 and almost 12, let's say, right? But I didn't start writing RPGs until like 2007 or 2008.
Okay.
And my first game was a fantasy game, but no, I became a writer of RPGs quite late.
Okay, so there's no relation between the two things. So that's why when we started writing, it was a long time after all that. So there was no.
I was a role player long before I became a magician, and I was a role-playing writer long after I became a magician.
Okay.
But I always had it in mind that I would have I wanted to create an RPG that was about real occultism, because I never thought that it had been done well before, right? Because most RPGs won't even bother to try to do something like that, and that's fine, right? Like nobody thinks that the way the occult is in Call of Cthulhu is real, except Benjer Satanis. Everybody else thinks it's pretend, right? So that's okay.
Do you find any game that has a closer approach to it besides your own, of course?
in terms of modern game, there was one game that came fairly close in terms of the trying to systematize the actual belief systems and practices of the Western occult world, which was C.J. Carella's Witchcraft. But the problem there is he didn't actually capture the social environment of people who play, of people who are involved in the occult world, right? So in the game Witchcraft, right, he's got like these different groups, the Wiccans and Norse pagans and Hermetic magicians, and all these are groups that, you know, that can be connected to actual movements in occultism today. And he has all these practices of magic that are an attempt to be like, you know, real hermetic, like the real Western people practice magic. But the really big problem he has there, besides that it's not really fully authentic, let's say, is that in his perspective, it's like everybody, you know, anybody who's part of a Wiccan coven does real magic. It was his point of view, right? And so in the game, it presents magic as something that is easy to do, and that the people, everybody who's involved in it is doing it, right? Anybody who's in the scene is doing it and can theoretically do it effectively, right? And I think that's where he gets it completely wrong. There's another game that gets it really right in that regard, but their actual magic system has nothing to do with real occultism. And that game is called Unknown Armies. Unknown Armies has a magic system that the author just made up, but its presentation of the modern occult scene is almost perfect, because it's very clear in that game that 90% of the people that are interested in occultism, including most Wiccans and most Norse pagans and most, you know, neo-druids and most Hermetic magicians, right, high magicians or whatever, and Thelemites, most Crowley people and most chaos magicians, they're all full of crap, right? Most of them aren't really doing anything. They're doing some kind of cosplay, right? Or they could do something if they applied themselves, but they don't. So they never end up being more than dabblers, right? And then there's only a tiny group who are actually doing it. But also that tiny group who are actually doing it are not like glamorous super wizards in the style of, you know, Doctor Strange or something like that. They're super nerdy obsessives that are walking this liminal space between like reaching the highest spiritual peaks, like between becoming a Buddha on the one hand, or just being a crazy person on the other. And you're constantly on that knife's edge between those two things, you know? So it's like, in Unknown Armies, it's very good at presenting that, because the magicians in Unknown Armies are people who very clearly, by the way he made his magic system, end up becoming outcasts of society, right? And that's true, right? And the more that you do it, the more obsessive that you become, and the more you have to be incredibly skillful and incredibly patient and incredibly disciplined to avoid falling into psychological traps. And so that's good. In Invisible College, I have both of those things, right? I have a magic system that really reflects what the modern Western magic is like, but I also have rules about things like attainment and mental trauma that make it very clear that you know, the path of the magician is this difficult thing, and it's not just about running around wearing funny robes and doing rituals under the full moon or something like that. And also in the setting, I explicitly say in the introduction to the book that almost everybody who claims to be part of the occult is not, right? Almost everybody who and not in the sense of whether or not you believe magic really works, but in the sense that they are posers or dabblers, right? They're either outright frauds, or they've convinced themselves that they're doing something, but they're not really doing anything, or they act like they know something, but their level of knowledge level is infantile, or, you know, or they're just there for a good time or to hit on chicks or something like that, you know?
Yeah, and that remembers again. That reminds me, takes me back again to Foucault's pendulum and the expression that he used for those people, the diabolics, because an expression that
well,
I love and I
Foucault's
use
pendulum is,
because it's fun.
Foucault's pendulum is awesome in regards to that. It was a very, I read that book very shortly after this whole incident that you've described. I must have been 19 when I read Foucault's pendulum. And I don't, yeah, at this point, that's a long time ago. And there are a lot of drugs that went in between then and now. But, you know, I remember how absolute genius it is, because it presents this scenario where you are, you know, you in the place of the protagonist are drawn into this kind of idea of maybe this great conspiracy with all these occult powers and all this stuff, and then you eventually realize that the whole thing is like just bullshit, right? And then it's
Yeah,
all,
but then
it's
everybody believes
all
it.
nonsense.
All the crazy people that all the dabblers believe that really there is a conspiracy, and they want to know it.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
a good
Well,
book to borrow to the dabblers. Yeah, here,
yeah,
read this book.
For me, it was
because
as
that's
an
exactly what it's like, you know. Like, I mean, the one part of the Invisible College that isn't real is that there isn't really a literal occult war going on with secret societies, right? And even there, I try to make a big effort to pop some of the secret society bubbles, because I talk about all the most famous conspiracies in my introduction. I point out that almost none of them are actually magical groups, or if they are, they aren't anymore. And that almost all of them are basically really boring, right? Like stuff like the, you know, Bohemian Grove and the Freemasons and the Rosicrucians and the Bavarian Illuminati. All of those are just either groups that don't exist anymore, or groups that are basically social clubs, or, you know, power groups, you know, networking groups like Skull and Bones. But they're not a secret conspiracy to control the world. The secret is that there isn't really a conflict of like groups. If there was, that would be easy. And what there is a conflict of paradigms, a conflict of worldviews of what humanity should be. And that's the difficult part.
What about the Black Lodge? Because that for me is a reference for Twin Peaks. So is there a real
Well,
occult
the
club?
Black Lodge is an interesting group, because out of all of the enemy groups, it's the one that there was never a literal Black Lodge in history. But the Black Lodge is a term that emerged. I think it probably began originally in like Masonic parlance of what nowadays is called clandestine or pseudo-Masonry. But it was very, very picked up later on by the Theosophists and the Golden Dawn, in a completely metaphorical sense, which is that the Black Lodge is the order of groups of people or individuals who have learned the practices and the techniques of Hermetic magic, but use it not to overcome their own egos and become and attain to a higher state of consciousness, but rather for their selfish purposes, right? For their ego-serving purposes, and who don't want to seek the illumination of the world, but rather would want to control the world, right? So the Black Lodge is a metaphor. And it would be a very interesting campaign if you wanted to do one. It would be a Foucault's pendulum campaign of the Invisible College, where you know the Black Lodge is fighting, and then you realize in the end that it's really a metaphor. You know, like the real fight is a fight of worldview, of how you want humanity to see itself and to see the world.
Since you mentioned that, I was wondering, could the Invisible College be used for a modern horror game in which the characters aren't magicians, or well, they don't have any kind of power?
No, I mean, if you look at the adventure seeds in the book, you see a lot of the tropes of, even though the game itself is more about like, you know, secret societies and conspiracies, it's a little bit closer to sort of Mage the Ascension than to Call of Cthulhu. There's a lot of potential for horror adventures and material in it. a lot of the adventure seeds in the book have stuff that would be, completely playable as a horror themed campaign. And if you look at like the effects of magic gone wrong, stuff like when you end up having people who are solipsists, or when you end up losing control of a goetic demon and things like that. And I talk also about, poltergeist effects. There's a monster section in the book that includes supernatural creatures, right? Both like ghosts and things like that, but also, demons and other types of astral entities that in theory could manifest in what is called manifest invisible appearance to the material world. And so you can use all of that. And also some of the groups, like the Nemites, for example, are inherently a horror type group. They don't want to eliminate mankind or control mankind or dominate mankind or oppress mankind or liberate mankind. What they want is humanity to evolve to a better and more just species, and they want to do that by transforming everyone into bug people. So that's definitely the sort of thing. Plus, you also have kind of Nazis and all the Nazi horror stuff you could use, right? Because the Order of Thule is one of the enemy groups, which was a real secret society also.
But rules-wise, if you wanted to run a campaign where the characters are regular people, for example, the kind of people you would play in a Call of Cthulhu campaign, investigators who have not really, they may be interested in occult, but just theoretically, not in practice. So is it possible to adapt the rules for? Well, of course it's possible.
Yeah,
but what should you have to do?
Well, it would be actually pretty simple, because what you would do is you'd create a character as a 0-level character, let's say, which is in the way that this variation of the OSR rules is created in the book. You roll up your stats, and then you determine. Usually you roll, but some DM might let you pick your social class, and that gives you some skills and determines kind of your wealth level. And then you do a roll for your education or your career, of what you did or what you were before joining the Invisible College. So that gives you some skills. And then you can roll for like a background event that would involve how you first, usually it involves how you discovered the occult world, right? And that sometimes gives you some other skill or bonus. And there you have basically a 0-level character that's good to go, right? And if you as a DM wanted to run a campaign where you couldn't be a magician, that there could be magic, but you might not be able to play an actual magician class, then I guess that what you'd have to do is either you could, what you could do is you could start out as a 0-level campaign and then probably slow down the level growth speed, right? And you would have, when characters level up, they would level up as a Templar class, because that class has skills, and which can include occultism skill, and they have combat bonuses, but they don't have any magic. So you could run it that way.
Yeah, I was asking this because, well, you usually play horror games, and it would be an interesting way to introduce the Invisible College, but without that dark fantasy, dark urban fantasy kind.
So we could play a Focus Pendulum campaign or a Ninth Gate campaign. That would be interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the Ninth Gate, another excellent, an excellent film there. Yeah.
Also, the original, the book. It's
I never read the book, but I saw Polanski's.
Yeah, the film is really good.
Yeah, I thought so. Anyway, but like I said, I haven't read the book there.
The book is strange.
I watched the Ninth Gate.
Yeah, the book is strange. It's called Dumas Club, and it has two stories. It has a story of the Nine Gates, and it has a story about the story of the movie, and then it has a story about actually the Dumas Club. That is a club of people that collect original versions of the Three Musketeers. So it's completely two different stories. So the movie actually works better just with one story.
Haven't you had any Reverte books? Arturo Pérez Reverte?
Have I read anything by Reverte? I mean, the name is familiar to me.
Yeah, he's kind of famous. He wrote the Triste books.
Oh yeah,
I was
of course,
wondering
yeah.
because, well, you know
Yeah,
Spanish,
that's where the name comes from.
yeah,
Right?
okay.
So this is interesting because I never heard of him when I was living in North America. Right, when I moved to South America,
Yeah, he's
Yeah.
famous there.
he's very, very popular, right? And I ended up, I didn't read any of his stuff until what happened was that I got the RPG, right? Because here in, I think it was actually in Buenos Aires, there I found it in a store, right? I guess the Spanish imprint did an RPG of Capitana La Triste. And I thought it was great, and so then I ended up reading one of the novels of the A La Triste series. But I don't have a lot of time for fiction, to be honest. I do a lot of reading of nonfiction, but I did read that, back in like, what would that have been, 2006 or so.
Normally that happens. People that read a lot of nonfiction, yeah, they don't have no time for to read fiction.
I've never bought that game, but it was a shame because it's probably an interesting game.
We have that game, A La Triste.
Not really. I just
okay.
I printed a
Okay.
PDF, but it's not. It's
you printed the PDF.
yeah. It's
well,
kind of pirated.
Yeah, okay. So let's cut this part.
When I decided to buy it, it was already out of print.
Available.
Yeah.
Yes, that's why.
I was lucky. I got that. I also got a first edition here in South America of the Aquelarre RPG, another Spanish RPG that
one is very famous.
It was a big inspiration for my Lion and Dragon game, because they really did that first, right? Because Aquelarre is very medieval authentic as a game, right? Like played, and their magic system is not. It's very different from my magic system in Lion and Dragon, but it's still in a way authentic, because my magic system in Lion and Dragon is based on how actual magicians in the Middle Ages did magic. But the magic system in Aquelarre is inspired by the way you see magic in Spanish folklore and fairy tales, right? And so that's authentic too, in a way.
Yeah.
It was like the popular version, right?
In an historical way, it's authentic too.
Yeah. It's authentic as folklore rather than authentic as practice,
So will there any be source books or something else for Invisible College?
Well, it's a bit early to say for sure. Like, I'm not working on anything at this moment, but I suspect that there probably will be. Now, The Invisible College is a very, very complete book. It's got, there's no question that it has everything you need to run the campaign. But that doesn't mean that I might not publish some adventures or something like that, or I could expand some of the magical techniques, or introduce a couple of other more unusual practices, or present some kind of source material of some of the other organizations or things that I touch on in the game. Like, one of the things I point out in the game is the idea of occult intelligence services, that there are, and in the real world, I expand them considerably in the game, but in the real world, all of the nations I mentioned dabbled in having their spy networks doing some kind of research into the paranormal and the occult, at one moment or another. But, certainly one expansion I could imagine doing, for example, would be something where instead of playing members of the Invisible College, you might play agents of MI13, or something like that,
Something like Conspiracy X did a long time ago.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that would be one possibility. Yeah.
You mentioned a while ago that you were writing something, but I didn't pick it up. So what are you writing now?
I'm currently, I actually just finished the writing part. It's now up to in the hands of my publisher, who is working on it. It's my next product is going to be, it's called Sword and Caravan. And it's going to be for Lion and Dragon, or, you know, basically for any OSR. It's going to be a largely system neutral setting book in the way that Dark Albion is. And Sword and Caravan is set in the year 1192. And it has a chronology that goes from 1192 to about 1220, 1222, let's say. And it's basically set in the Middle East and the Silk Road during the time of the Third Crusade onwards. And this was the period where Europeans actually started in meaningful numbers trading along the Silk Roads for themselves. It was the first period where that happened. It was one of the consequences of the Third Crusade was that the Silk Road was opened up and trade increased between Europe and the East. And I was originally planning to do just like this started with the idea of making a small source book where you were playing the Third Crusade. But the more I researched into it, the more I got fascinated with the details of the whole world of that region as it was in that moment, which is also a very special moment because it's immediately before an apocalypse that none of them realized was about to happen, which is the Mongol invasions, right? By 1222, the whole world I describe in this setting is gone. It's been completely devastated, right? And it's a fascinating world, this world of this incredible civilization that spanned from Damascus into, you know, Lanzhou, China, that was this like artery of trade and of cultural exchange, and this incredible mix of cultures and peoples, and therefore also of, you know, myths and legends and magic and monsters and all this stuff that you can use in a D&D context. And so it's a game where you're going to be able to play, you can play it as a Crusades game. You could have, you know, just your European knights go there and fight to liberate Acre, or you could, and to rescue Jerusalem if you want to try, or you can play it as a game of European explorers and or natives of the region going on the Silk Road, you know, to the east, or from the east to the west, I guess. So it's going to be a very open kind of sandbox where every single area of this region is going to be described, and there's all kinds of notes on the culture, on the monsters, on the magic. There's some new classes in there, all kinds of stuff that will make it, you know, as rich as what Dark Albion does for England or what Eros of Indra does for India. This is going to do to the Middle East and the Silk Route during this period.
So we can anticipate a lot of controversy. If players are going to play Crusaders, that will be racist.
Well, yeah, I mean, undoubtedly, you're going to have certain people that, as soon as they hear what the game is about, are going to absolutely blow their top, right? I mean, I was almost tempted to just call it Deus Vult just to fuck with them, right? but that's actually, you know, the funny thing is going to be that anybody who actually reads the book is not going to be able to find anything in there that they're going to be able to legitimately take a meaningful offense. So I'm sure they'll find something to pretend to be terribly offended about, right?
They don't have to read it, right? They just...
This book is history, right? And it's going to present the history, and it's the cultures presented as they were, right? And I'm not, I don't even take sides, so to say, right? I present
history is
the side of the Crusaders. Sorry?
History is offensive, sorry. You know.
Yeah, history is offensive just by itself, sure. But I don't take a side, right? I'm presenting the Crusaders in the light of what they believed and what they thought they were doing. And I'm presenting the forces of Saladin as what they believed and what they were doing, and all of these other groups that are, you know, in the region also in the same way. In every culture, I try to present the culture from the point of view of their paradigm and what they thought, you know, and what they believed to be their world, you know, and what would motivate them to do what they do.
It's kind of what we did with Arrows of Indra. It was also another culture, and historical accurate, I think.
Yeah, it was at least it was as historically accurate as you can get when you're representing a history that we know isn't really exactly how things were, right? Because the Eras of Indra was based on the world of India as presented in the Mahabharata, but the world of India in Mahabharata is like the world of England in King Arthur, right? It never really existed exactly like that, right?
Yeah.
But yes, so I present all of like the Indian culture from in the world of the people that wrote the Mahabharata. So what was the late Vedic period, you could say, right? The period of Brahmanism, and you know, there are things about that world which are controversial, right? So some of the politically correct people were upset that I presented, you know,
they were even upset that back then it was 2000 and what, 14, 13?
Yeah, 2013.
And back then they were upset?
Well, some of them did get upset.
Not as much as they are now.
Well, yeah, there have been always people that didn't like me, right? So, and by then there was already political people, activists in the story games. I mean, the story games movement was very leftist by itself, right? Not, you know, a shadow of what they are today, but they were already very leftist for that time, right? So there were people that were saying that somehow me presenting the caste system in the game, and when you play characters of different castes, like you could end up being an untouchable or a Brahmin or whatever, and they're saying, well, that's offensive. I'm like, well, that's a fundamental part of all of Indian civilization from the Vedic period until the British put an end to it, you know, like
the evil British.
I think they sometimes some of them still think a bit about that, so it doesn't.
Now, to be fair, I also had like conservatives who read that book and were like, oh, why the hell is he talking about transgender people in the book, right? And I'm like, well, you know, it's the Indian culture, through most of its culture, always had a concept of a third gender, and so I wouldn't be presenting the culture as it really was if there was only the two gender types present, you know, like that's an important part of it, right? There are parts of stories in the Mahabharata where major characters end up, you know, switching gender in certain ways, right? So this is something that was necessary to include, you know. But yeah, I always do it this way. I always present. I never, you know, I don't have a political side in Dark Albion, right? I'm not a Yorkist or a Lancastrian, and I'm not trying to tell any kind of modern story. I'm not using it as an allegory for, you know, George Bush or Donald Trump or something like that, right? I'm not using it as an allegory for anything. I believe in presenting the history, right? The only book where I kind of take a side is The Invisible College, right? That's the only one. That's the closest product I've ever made to propaganda, because obviously, you know, I kind of believe in these classical liberal values of modernism that the Invisible College created, and that was later presented to the world in the Enlightenment and by you know, groups like the Freemasons, and then, you know, all of the you know, and the founding fathers of the United States, right, and all of that. So that is kind of my side, right? But even there, I try to downplay any partisanship I have as much as possible, at least as much as possible as I can in a game where I made them the good guys and everybody else the bad guys, right?
That's interesting, because although in fact you don't take sides on your work, you're still accused of several things, and not just because those things are your opinion or not. That's irrelevant, but they really aren't transported into your work, but then they cancel your work, not just yourself. So it's interesting coming from people who are actually putting their own agendas into their own work, which is completely different from what you do.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you look at the propagandism in almost all of the what lately some people have been calling the woke SR, the former story gamers who realized they couldn't make any money off story games anymore, and then joined the OSR as indie or DIY OSR people when they really hate the OSR and they hate D&D, but that's where the money is, so they joined it. And now they write products about, leftist politics with really bad game mechanics that they try to trick people into buying by calling OSR. And at the same time, they go on political diatribes on Twitter about how awful, gamers are and how awful people like me are for, making games that people want to actually play. and they accuse me of all kinds of stuff,
This week on Twitter, you're mentioning something about pyramid schemes going on, some of those groups. What do you mean about that? It's there are some people that are using other people and their efforts to come into the, I'm not sure if it was the OSR movement, I think.
Yeah, well, look, right now there's two groups that kind of both use the term OSR, though one of them keeps constantly trying not to use that term, but then they always have to come back because they realize that the only reason their books make money is because people confuse them with OSR books, right? So that group is the leftist group, the SJW wokists who have entered into OSR environments that make these games that at the same time as they talk about how toxic traditional D&D is and regular gamers are. And so they are, that at one point they tried to say, well, the OSR is dead. And then they tried to rename themselves Sword Dream and stuff like that, right? And then they just always keep coming back to calling themselves OSR anyways, because they realize that the OSR doesn't just die when they say so. And the rest of us keep making good product, and they keep realizing that without association to the OSR, their money-making scheme is gone, right? But that's not really the pyramid part of it. The pyramid part of it is that, this came out of a discussion that I had with Taylor Lane, who's a very interesting person, game designer, who had originally been involved with that kind of side of the indie OSR scene, with the side that is the woke side, let's say, that were more attuned to kind of hard left philosophy and stuff. And Taylor Lane is queer and agendered, right? So they looked at the propaganda that side put out about, let's call it the regular OSR, and they assumed that the regular OSR was going to be, unwelcoming, and so they went over to the places where the woke OSR hangs out, right? And tried to start, they wanted to present RPG product and stuff like that, and they very quickly discovered that that whole group is controlled by a faction of people with high social influence within the in-group. And that high social influence group in these places like their Discord and on these groups that they have in other, social media apps, they have a pecking order that's always pecking down, right? Where anyone who tries to produce a product, if they haven't gone through enough time of apprenticeship at, licking boots of these higher ups, of talking about how great they are, if they don't spend enough time promoting the products that those higher up people are trying to sell and promoting their Kickstarters, that's what the lower down people, the newbies, are for, right? And if you do a really good job at that, and you talk a good talk about intersectional politics, then eventually maybe they're going to start promoting your work, and then you'll be part of the top of the scheme, right? But they can't have too many people at the top, so it's always a very competitive, cutthroat environment where everybody's trying to undermine everybody else to claw their way up to the special in-group at the top of the thing. And everybody's constantly forced to praise those special people at the top and to promote them and to make it look like they're much more popular than they are by almost putting in labor to promote it, right? While they're struggling to try to get up into that group themselves, right? So that's the structure of a pyramid scheme.
right? And that side, their public presentation is always this like supposedly virtuous presentation of, you know, we're all about community and diversity and inclusion. We're like a family, exactly.
Yeah.
Right? But at the personal level, and this is, you know, I kind of already guessed this, but Taylor Lane's experience made it really clear that at the abstract level, they're all about, you know, love and caring and understanding. At the personal level, they're absolutely cutthroat, and they're all about control and dominance and about undermining anyone that could be what they perceive as a threat to their own profit, right? And then ironically, the regular OSR, you know, when we talk in the abstract, we're pretty crude and we're pretty, sometimes we sound mean, right? We're all about, you know, we just want a game and we're not interested in your politics. We don't give a shit what your race or gender is. We just want the game and we don't want your politics in our games, and on this sort of stuff, right? And so we, on the abstract, we sound quite mean. At the personal level, though, the way that the regular OSR evolved, it evolved by an environment where everybody was a meritocracy, right? If you make good products, then other people are going to want to share about your good products, not because they're forced to, not because it's going to improve their hype or something, but because you're really like these games. And so you're going to look at cool stuff and tell other people about that cool stuff just because you play it, right? And because you enjoy it. And other people, if you write cool stuff, are going to do the same thing for you. So it becomes an environment where creators, as long as the people that are trying to get into that environment have talent, creators are going to help lift them up rather than bring them down, because we realize that if they make stuff that is different and interesting, that's going to inspire us, and we can also rip off some of their stuff and present it in different ways and then add something to it and keep this process going, right? So we are, at the personal level, incredibly supportive of each other, right? Even if at the abstract level, we look kind of mean and gruff, right? Whereas the other side is the exact opposite of us.
Though I'm not OSR, I can tell a story that proves this. I started publishing about a year ago, and it took me about 2 weeks to start because James Desborough saw one of my scenarios, and he said,
Grim
"Okay,
Jim.
Grim Jim," and he said, "Okay, I'll publish it," and then we started working together. I've published 6 books last year, and basically that I didn't have to lick boots and nothing like that. Just work.
Yeah, well, that's a great example, right? Like Grim Jim set up his own publishing house. Joe Bittman now has his own store too. And so like, if you're an independent creator, even if you're making like little small press stuff, there's places where you can sell your stuff, right? And if your stuff is creative, people they don't care if you're, you know, if you're Portuguese or English or American, they don't care if you're black or white or yellow. They don't care what your gender is. They don't care what your sex is.
Yeah.
And you know, that to some people is offensive in and of itself, because they think that that's got to be the most important thing. But you know, the fact that nobody will care means that the only thing that will matter is do you write interesting stuff, right? And if you do that, you're going to do well. And nobody's gonna, you know, you don't even have to tell people, if you don't want to, what your background is. You just have to make a product that is engaging, and it does, and that's going to, you know, be super popular. And a lot of some of the most innovative and popular stuff in the OSR product line is not even, you know, like traditionalist in the sense of inspired by you know, Western medieval Europe, you know. So you know, stuff like Arrows of Indra or Yoon Suin, right, are products that are inspired by foreign cultures, and there's a lot of other ones. Those are just 2 examples.
I think one of the reasons they hate so much you or Venger, for example, is because you have success.
Yeah, of course. I mean, they nothing drives them crazier than the fact that they've been telling everyone that I'm supposed to be canceled for like 10 years now, and yet every single month I'm making better than I did the month before. You know, I'm being more followed, more popular, more prosperous, you know.
But you like to you like to push them, because you sometimes talk about that, and I can understand that you are talking not to your followers because they know it, but to your enemies sometimes.
Yeah, and I mean, I was raised in a context where talking about money or things like that, or how much you earn or that sort of thing, is very it's a little bit unbecoming, right? And so for me, it is not in my nature to usually do that. But these assholes basically force me to, right? Because the fact is, you know, they constantly like, yeah, this guy, Gareth Michael Skarka, at one point said, oh, the pundit has never done anything of consequence in RPGs, right? And this is the guy, Gareth Michael Skarka. He was supposed to put out a product in 2012 from a Kickstarter, huge Kickstarter at the time, called Far West. It still hasn't come out.
Oh,
There
yeah,
are people,
I know that.
there are people who gave money to Far West, and he took their money. He never gave it back, right? He took their money, and they at the time that they funded Far West, they were unmarried and childless, right? And now they can have a kid in the 4th grade, right? They can have a 10-year-old. And so this asshole who's produced nothing of value since then is saying this about me when I've produced, in the same period of time, 120 different RPG products, you know? And I'm one of a tiny handful of people that makes a full-time living now from RPGs, you know. And some of these guys, they've said, oh, well, you know, the RPG Pundit is a trust fund baby, so I don't even know where they got that idea from, you know. It is true that I do not come from a particularly poor family, but it's also true that I haven't accepted a cent from my parents or any of my family from the age of 18 onwards. You know, everything I do with my own money, right? I've earned my own way, and I didn't use, you know, networking or anything like that. You know, like no, at least not networking that I didn't set up myself, right? I mean, this is not a case where, you know, like I'm not some independently wealthy person who happens to make RPGs. You know, RPGs is, you know, what I live.
You are
on.
living in Uruguay, right?
That's
So
right.
you don't need as much money as someone who is living
That's
in
true.
US.
I will point out that if somebody is living, you know, like in London or Paris or New York, with what I earn, you would not be making a living, right? You would not be, I don't know, you might be able to afford like the shittiest apartment in the world, and then you would have nothing to eat, right? But with the money I'm making, you know, I can live a very comfortable life here in Uruguay. And with the money I'm making, you could probably live a pretty good life in a lot of middle-sized American cities, for example, right? Like you wouldn't be rich, but you certainly wouldn't be destitute, right?
Yeah. So in spite of that reputation and what some people are trying to pass as your reputation, you still manage all that. How did you circumvent that canceling?
Well, that's a very good question. I think in the first place, one thing I did is I never backed down, right? And I didn't try to apologize or something like that, because there was nothing that I had to apologize for.
And it wouldn't work anyway.
I always push into the offensive, right? So if someone is attacking me, I will attack right back, right? And I will respond with vicious mockery, because there's nothing that the SJWs are more afraid of than being laughed at, right? Way more than, you know, people who make jokes about them. You know, Dave Chappelle is more dangerous to the SJWs than 10,000 idiots with tiki torches would be, right? Like people who get mad at them and just break stuff or something like that, that is not a threat. But people who are clever and make a mockery of them, like I do in every YouTube video I can, right? Those guys are the dangerous ones for them. That's what they're so scared of, right? That's why, you know, that's why they're always trying to find some bigger way to attack. Now the thing is, if in a way SJWs have become victims of their own hype, because now nobody, nobody reasonable would believe them anyways, right? But if you stand up and point out how ridiculous they are, that certainly helps. I built up my own fan base, so I had a group of people that would be supporters, and you could tell the difference, because I remember back in 2014, let's say, during Consultant Gate and things like that, I felt for a long time before then and after then for a couple of years, like there was just a tiny handful of us, just like a few guys shouting in the wilderness against these people. And that, I remember I would sometimes post something on Google Plus or something like that. And I knew that I would be the only one arguing with 200 guys that would be summoned up to brigade you from the SJWs, and I'd be the only one saying it. Now I'd get, at that same time, back in 2014, I'd get 50 secret messages from people saying, oh, you're so brave what you're doing. I want you to know I support you. And I'm like, well, why don't you say so in the Google Plus thread? And they're like, oh no, I can't, because then they'll attack me, right? But I really have, you have my support. And some people in the game industry said that to me. It's like people that wrote me that have published stuff that have names you would recognize said that stuff to me, and have not to this day felt brave enough to stand up to these people, right? But back then that was the norm, and I just got used to being able to fight one man against 200 of them, right? But I noticed that over the last 2 or 3 years, there have been gradually more and more people, because it used to be I might get 1 or 2 other brave people that would chime in and kind of join the fight, and then I got a bunch of people, and now there's other people that are already in a fight, and they call me to come and help them, right? So this is really altered, and even in places where where the SJWs clearly have all the advantages, places like Twitter, where that they will never get blocked, or they'll never get banned for anything, but
Yep.
that you could be banned if you're not careful of how you speak to them. Even there, they get swamped now by people saying that they're idiots, so that was a big change. Also, I wasn't, I was, even in the work I was doing before RPGs, I was in a field where I knew that I was not cancelable in that way. So I was not, they could never fire me. So that was an advantage, right? And in RPGs, I've basically been in business as a true freelance writer, in that I'm not a publisher, right? I don't make my own products. I work with publishers. I've never published an RPG book in my life. I write them and then I get someone else to publish them. So this has the effect that if they were somehow able to cancel one of those publishers, I could still keep doing what I'm doing, and they can't stop it, right? And if they tried to cancel, and on the other hand, if they tried to pressure for me to be canceled, there would be a half dozen publishers that would all be affected by that would come to my defense, right? So this is a strategy that gives a certain amount of protection, because if you're going to really fight these guys, you have to do everything possible to make yourself as uncancelable as possible.
So that that you were mentioning before, that's why you are so optimistic about this, that from the last 10 years you started seeing more people fighting them from.
Yeah.
Do you
Yeah,
think it's
I've
because
seen them becoming more
they are
powerful.
getting more
too.
obnoxious? Yes, they are getting more powerful, more obnoxious, and maybe more people are getting tired of them.
What I've seen is that they're, compared, let's say from 2012 till today, right? What I've seen is their voice and their power and their institutional power was growing, right? And for a long time, it was growing faster than anybody opposing them. And then what happened is gradually, starting probably around 2016 or so, the opposing forces started to gain more in voice. We had not gained a lot in institutional power, right? All of the major social media is still strongly on their side. The political institutions are on their side. But we've gained a lot in influence, and we've been able to create some successful alternate infrastructure. And at the same time, you're now seeing a point where their soft power, their power to threaten, has finally, in the last year and a half or so, started to decline. Because there was a time when just somebody saying, Mr. Jones is a transphobe with no evidence or whatever, right? Or is a homophobe or is a bigot, right? That would end up potentially leading to that person's destruction, right? They would lose their career, they'd lose their social media accounts, they might lose their banking rights, they could lose everything, right? And now that seems to be getting weaker and weaker because they've overplayed their hand. And there is a bigger pushback. And now in the last, really in this last year, we've seen a pushback that has shown up as a kind of popular grassroots movement, like the things you've seen in Virginia, the elections there, which were a reaction to when, the people in the woke camp started trying to go directly for normal people's kids, right? And to attack the parents if the parents complained, right? And then so they've gone a step too far, and I think that's going to be the beginning of the end of their institutional power. But it's not. This is not the beginning of the end. This is maybe the beginning of that. Like it's a long road ahead that we're still gonna have to fight with these people. So I do feel more optimistic. I think that our situation is stronger now. Our forces are stronger than they were before.
The woke will not necessarily go broke right now, but there will be someone trying to rival them, and probably there will be two sides on equal positions, maybe.
Well, capitalism is a marvelous thing, and I think that there's only so long that they can keep trying to fool. There's right now this alliance, this corporate woke alliance, because corporations were infiltrated by wokist people. And then those wokist people convince the people that aren't woke in any sort of way, but that only care about their money,
yeah.
The CEOs and the investors, they convinced them that going woke was going to make them money and that it was the right strategy. It was going to save their company, or it was going to give them record profits, right? And because the march of change in big corporations tends to be slow, these are things that take several years to work out. And so they went on a trend of starting to set up all this stuff. And then they started releasing this stuff. And then this stuff didn't start doing so well. And the more woke that they made it, the less well it started doing. And there's always that process of, well, the problem was we didn't make it woke enough, right? So they tried to make it more woke. And then it flops worse. And so, it gets to where if at some point Disney realizes that if The Mandalorian is the only thing that's making them money and it's the only thing that's not woke, maybe the problem is wokeness, right? And when you look at television, when some of the most successful television shows are the only shows that aren't woke, shows like Yellowstone, that are having huge success. And now the guy that made Yellowstone is making another half dozen shows. Why? Because his shows make money, right? Because he doesn't do a woke show, right? So this is something where eventually the executives are going to say, well, okay, this makes money, that doesn't, we're going to stop doing that, But along the way, there has to be a lot of damage before that happens. And once they realize that, it takes about another 2 years for the ship to completely turn, right? Remember that the books like the ones that have come out right now, like Fitzhaven, or this, the Carnival source book, the last two D&D books that have come out that were absolutely super woke, those products began being planned about 2 years earlier, So the products that are being planned right now that are going to come out in, 2024 are still going to be woke, but it's because it's being planned by the same people. And unless Hasbro has secretly told them that they have to radically change, I don't think that's likely. Hasbro maybe has given them some kind of a warning that they better start making better profits than what they're doing right now. But for the moment, a lot of D&D's profits are running on inertia, right? Like they're running on the success that was D&D originally, 5th edition originally, I mean, right? And so it takes a long time to because fans, especially nerd fandom, is kind of, it's got that somewhat autistic quality of obsessive collecting, right? So it takes a lot to piss off a fan to the point that they say, I hate this and I'm going to stop buying it. It'll take a long time of them saying, I hate this, but I have to buy it anyways, because otherwise
Yeah, I
I don't
know.
have the complete set,
That annoys me
That's
about
very noticeable in relation
that they,
to
like
D&D. So
these
Yes.
fucking
in
these
Star
nerds,
Wars.
yeah, the fucking Star Wars nerds, they don't realize that what they loved was murdered by someone. That person peeled off the skin of what they loved and is wearing that skin as a face right now, and is telling you that means you have to buy it because look, it looks like C-3PO or whatever, right? No, these assholes killed C-3PO. They murdered C-3PO, and now they're waving his head around like a puppet for you to give them money. Like if nerds figured that out faster, these guys would be done sooner. But unfortunately, that's not happening.
but still
So it's going to take time.
in the RPG world, there are still Kickstarters doing lots of money right now, and well, probably not this week, but 1 month ago, 2 months ago, there were several. During last year, there were several very woke role-playing games that made thousands of dollars probably on Kickstarter. So there are still a lot of role players, or perhaps role players, who are willing to spend money on those things. Of course, those ones are the woke, of course.
Yeah, there are a couple of types of those, right? Because there's some that are woke games that don't tell you they're woke, right? And that's the worst because those are like deceptive, right? They present themselves as, this is a hardcore dungeon crawling game, and then you find out that it's actually about intersectional feminism, but they don't tell you that up front, right? And that's absolutely disgusting, right? And that's what a lot of the so-called woke OSR lives on, right? They present you these games like Troika is this weird and exciting, cool, unusual fantasy game in like weird gonzo fantasy world, and no, actually it's an SJW product, right? But they make you think that it's just a cool hipster product, like something Zach Smith would have written, But then the other type is the type that tells you it's woke, right? And those types are products that are ideal for Kickstarter, right? They're products that if they weren't made as a Kickstarter would make hardly any money. But as a Kickstarter, it's perfect because they're not selling a game book as a Kickstarter. As a Kickstarter, they're selling people the right to post on their social media and let you know that they supported this Kickstarter, right? So a Kickstarter about, imagine a world where all the white people died and Native Americans became a superpower, right? Like that sort of book is a book where the person who's giving money they're probably never going to use that in any game. They're not going to play it. They might not even read it. I don't know. They might look at the pictures, I guess, and read a little bit of it and then get bored and put it on their shelf with all their other woke books that they never read, right? But that doesn't matter. So again, it doesn't even matter if the creators never actually ship the product, right? Because there's such a huge percentage of these woke Kickstarters that never appear, right? Like the famous Afrofuturism RPG that this guy that invented the Sword Dream, he made a Kickstarter that got like hundreds of thousands of dollars. It never manifested. It never came out, right? And so like all of these guys, that's not important. What's important is that when you've given money, you can then say, I was a supporter of this product, and you can show it off to people that you were so woke that you supported this product about all the white people being dead, and then so that's so woke, so like that's what they're paying for. They're paying for that, and they're paying to feel smug about themselves, which is the same reason people used to buy story games in the early 2000s, right? That nobody liked story games. They bought it to think, look at how, I'm a really intellectual person and I don't just play D&D. D&D is for idiots, So like, I've bought the Shabal Hiri Roach or Dogs in the Vineyard. It's the sophisticated literary game.
Those
you know?
people don't understand that there are more role plays besides D&D. There's a whole world of role plays that they can play.
And that D&D is can be used to make incredibly sophisticated worlds, right? Like they're just not pretentious about it. You know, like them making it pretentious makes it very clear that it's not about the game at all, right? And it's the same thing with wokeness, is just the highest level of pretentiousness, right? The same people that used to act superior because they play Vampire the Masquerade and not Dungeons and Dragons now get to act superior because they think they're ending imperialism by supporting a woke Kickstarter, right? And so it's
Not all of them. I played Vampire back in the day.
And now they're shooting heroin, you know, like yeah, but Vampire was like a starter drug, right? Not everybody who smokes weed ends up shooting heroin, but everybody who shoots heroin probably smoked weed at some point, you know?
Yeah, probably. So there's a very big difficulty of for independent game designers to get their product known by people who are usually buying commercial games like Dungeons and Dragons. Probably most people who are playing Dungeons and Dragons, and probably, well, even Vampire and some other commercial games, have never even heard about your games, probably. Why there is a barrier that you cannot cross, or only sometimes you can cross? What's stopping it?
Well, it's a problem of I mean, in as much as it is a problem, I'm not sure it is a problem. Right?
Well,
it's sort of like saying, well, you know, the in 1980s comic books, you had, you know, Marvel and DC comics. You know, you had Superman and Spider-Man and that, and then you had like this tiny small press that was doing, you know, some kind of really weird comic book, and how come they couldn't get all the people that buy DC comics to buy their comic, right? It's that for all of the history of RPGs, D&D was the most recognizable, the biggest RPG in the world. And for most of the history of RPGs, most people who played RPGs only played Dungeons and Dragons, right? So that's not surprising. And they only bought the mainstream product. And, you know, TSR was a big company, and now, you know, Wizards is literally Hasbro. It's one of the largest corporations in the world, right? It's not something that you're competing against even, right? It's an irrelevancy, you know, like, it's like it's like saying, well, you know, there's Disney World over here, and over here is, I don't know, the Museum of Pipes, you know, like, so, yeah, if you're really into pipes, you're gonna fucking love the Museum of Pipes. You're gonna have more fun than they're there than in Disney World, right? But then you're not gonna get Disney World people to go over there. So like the real challenge for a person shouldn't be to like compete with D&D, which is now the only mainstream product, by the way. There used to be a time, right, like in the 80s, the 90s, that it was that was TSR and certain other large companies that were like actually always lesser but viable competitors, to the point that White Wolf was almost, you know, and that there was a point in the 90s where White Wolf was probably outselling D&D, right? Like where Vampire World of Darkness stuff collectively was doing better than D&D was collectively, right? But that's long gone, right? Now it's just D&D. Even Paizo, as soon as 5th edition came out, Paizo has lost an enormous percentage of the market share. So now they're practically irrelevant. And that's always the way it was. That's always the way it's probably going to be, unless something really weird happens, like, you know, Hasbro decides to just stop publishing D&D, which could happen. You know, like if D&D lost too much money for them, they might say, well, we're just going to do something that we've done with other games, which is we're going to put away this game. It's not going to be for sale anymore for like 10 or 20 years. And then we'll re-release it, brand new projects, start again, do a reboot and see how it goes, right? So that could happen. But other than that, you know, you've always had D&D at the top. And the important thing is not how do you compete with that, it's how do you draw attention to the alternative side of the gaming field. And this is one of the places where the OSR has a big advantage, right? Because one of the big barriers to playing a game other than D&D is that, you know, most players of D&D know the D&D rules. They don't want to learn a whole other set of rules to play a different game, right? They like the D&D rules. A lot of people who make other types of games think, well, but these rules are so much better than D&D's rules. But the typical D&D player doesn't think they are. If not, they would have been interested in that already, you know? So having an OSR product, you can say, well, you know, these are the same rules as D&D, you know? There are slight variations because it's from an older edition, but it's the same system, right? So that instantly allows, you know, like when the 6 stats are the same, you know, strength, dex, intelligence, constitution, charisma, wisdom, you know, they're all the same stuff. There's armor class, you know, there's to hit bonuses, you roll a d20 to hit, all of that stuff is the same, right? The magic system is the same in a lot of the OSR products, not in mine, but in a lot of them. So, you know, that makes it approachable. And so you can kind of infiltrate. There's actually a sub-movement within the OSR, which is called the O5R movement, right? Which is people that are making stuff that is OSR that's meant to be compatible with 5th edition, or people making 5th edition stuff to be compatible with the OSR, right? And now that there's like the DMs Guild, there are some people, not as many as I would have thought, but there have certainly been some people that have been making products that are compatible, that are meant to be playable, compatible with both, like with an OSR rule set and with 5th edition at the same time, right? And Venger does the reverse of that with Chalt, right? Like in his Chalt book, his stats in those books are all set up in such a way that someone who is playing 5e D&D could use them, or that someone who's playing an OSR game could use them.
So,
and so I think that's one of the ways that you attract people. The other is through, you know, just self-promotion and publishing. So, you know, when you see people talking about D&D on a hashtag, you know, for me, the way I do it, for example, in as much as I believe in proselytizing, I'm pretty convinced that most of the people who buy my products are going to be people that are already not, you know, standard D&D 5e players, right? But especially because, you know, most of them are going to be OSR grognards, right? But in as much as I do this, you know, I could look at some thread where they're talking about something in D&D. Maybe some people who play D&D 5th edition are complaining about something like, say, the latest books. And so there I end up linking to one of my videos where I'm criticizing that book, right? And so they'll see that. And in all my videos, you see my books, right? And I talk about my products, or I talk about the OSR, right? I did a video that's just about the OSR, which is basically like a promotional video of the OSR, not just my books, but all of the OSR. And anytime I can, I share that with people who clearly have never heard of the OSR, you know, but who are playing and complaining about aspects of 5th edition. So I think that's what you have to do.
More aggressive marketing, right? It's necessary.
It's all about, you know, promotion is a very important part of being a successful game designer. And nobody else is going to promote you. I mean, somebody might, but you can't count on that, right? So you have to be willing to promote yourself, and you should do it in a, you know, I don't know if tasteful is the word to put it, because there's tastes vary, but in a you should do it in an honest way, right? Like what I think is not right is if you're either using sock puppets or promoting stuff that is like actually your own work, but you don't say it is, you know, or stuff like that. That sort of stuff is really shitty behavior, right? But if you're honest, you say, well, this is my book, I think it's great, here's why I think it's great, I hope you'll like it too. There's nothing wrong with that, you know, there's nothing wrong with that. That's not grifting. Grifting is where you're basically trying to rip someone off, right? Like grifting is woke leftists making a game that's about woke ideology and then calling it an OSR dungeon crawl game or something like that, you know?
Sometimes I like what they fool people, but then they have that disclaimer that says, if you are a fascist, you shouldn't play this game.
Yeah.
Or if you don't believe that Black Lives Matters or whatever, one of their slogans, you're a fascist and you shouldn't play this game. That really annoys me. And I guess it annoys people that are fooled into buying games into quick starters, and then they go and see, oh, this is a woke game. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's why we created. Well, I didn't have anything to do with it myself, but on the RPG site, which is the forum that I own, a guy named Occult came up with the idea of making a consumer report style list. So this is something that you can find on the RPG site, which is called the TTRPG Guide to Woke Companies.
Yeah.
And it is basically a list of companies that are green, yellow, and red, so to say, where the green companies are the ones that are basically just gaming companies with no woke content. Yellow is that they've occasionally done some woke stuff, and red are the ones that are like active ideological propagandists, you know. And they got really mad when this list came up. They tried to say I invented it. I didn't have anything to do with inventing it, but I certainly endorse it. I think it's a great list. They've made lists of people who knew, you know, they've gone and done literal lists of people who had said, you must block these people and everybody who is friends with these people from your Twitter, or else we will
They're
block
always
you.
doing how is it called? Block lists, right? On Twitter.
Block lists. And they've done lists of game companies that have to be canceled, that they want to like boycott, or that they want to campaign to have, like, you know, to get them demonetized or to get them out of conventions. But they seem really upset and think that, you know, it's totally unfair that someone's making a list about them, you know.
That was very fun.
But the list, they can use the list on their own side. So they can just
Oh, yeah, they
revert
could.
it and use it for themselves.
I think they
If
used
you're
it.
Look, if you're an intersectional leftist, you can go to that same page and you will honestly see which products and which publishers are actively intersectional leftists, you know, woke leftists that support the same things you support and buy their products. That's perfectly fine, right? But the main people, the people that complained the most about that list were the ones that were like the secretly woke people, right? The people that only say terrible, terrible shit on places where they think most of their potential customers won't see it, right? Like on Discord or on Twitter and stuff like that. But then in their actual marketing, try to market their games as if they were like just, you know, fun action combat RPGs, you know, or something like that.
So that was what started that problem with the list. Some people didn't want to be there. Not the really woke, because those are probably happy to be there, but the other ones who try to pretend they aren't. Sometimes.
Well, you know, there are some people who are woke and pretend to be in the business of game design, and then there are some people that are in the business of game design, though clearly only in it for the money, that pretend to be woke, right? And so it's very hard sometimes to tell which is which. You know?
Yeah, it's really strange. The wokeness has started to spread in different ways. And
I forget who it was that said that every great cause starts as a movement and gradually turns into a racket, right? It starts as a movement, it becomes a business, and then it turns into a racket, right? So like you see that with wokeness, absolutely, right? Like that at first there's a bunch of these political ideologues doing it for the virtue signaling. Then they realize they could make money off it. And now it's basically a protection racket, right? Where you have to pay to hire the diversity consultant, or we're going to cancel you.
That's really strange. Those sensitivity readers who probably don't even read anything, but they are paid to do it. It's really strange.
I like the way what you normally say, Miguel, that you have such a nice game here. You don't want me to break it, do you?
It looks like a mob racket.
Yeah, it is. It's literally, it's like protection money, right? And also, when you see some of these woke Kickstarters, and you look at all the people that are involved in them versus the money that they made, right? Like, yeah, let's say this woke Kickstarter, it made $200,000. That seems like an incredible amount of money, right? Now, take out of that all the production costs, assuming that they actually produce the product. But even if they don't, right? Let's say that they don't actually produce the product. There's still like, you know, there's like always 5 game designers that are involved in it, a half dozen artists, and then, you know, you have the editor or whatever. And then you have, there has to be like 6 or 7 different types of cultural consultants and sensitivity readers and diversity managers, right? And so you end up having like 20 people being involved in this product, right? So even if it's just a complete scam, they have no intention of producing anything, so they're not going to sink any of that money. It's pure profit other than whatever Kickstarter's percentage is. You're still getting like each of those people ends up making less than $10,000, you know, like that's not a lot of money, you know?
Yeah,
So
okay.
and that's when you calculate all the figures of, you know, how much they raise, you know, there was this Kickstarter that happened recently that was like called LATAM Breakout. And it was started by a couple of Englishmen, you know, and then they hired out to make 5 mini RPGs by 5 of the best Latin American game designers, and they like picked 5 people nobody had ever heard of, right? Like two Argentinians and 3 Brazilians. And these people, the only ones that were known at all were known not for their products, but for being, you know, woke campaigners on Twitter. And then besides those 5, they also had like another 10 people that were involved in doing the editing for these 5 products and or the art, right? And so you look at the list of all of those people, right? That's like the five writers, right? The 10 editors and artists, right? That's 15. The 2 guys that started it, you know, that are probably going to take a slightly larger take of the money, right? And so that's like 17 of them. And if, you know, their product raised like, it raised like 30,000 pounds or something like that. So it's like what, $40,000, right? But divided 17 ways, none of those people are getting more money than I earn in a month. You know, they're getting a lot less than what I earn in a month, you know?
Yeah, I get it. Well, in a way that reminds me another thing. So you are partly or all a Latino, right? Hispanic, and
Yeah, I mean, I'm Latino, ethnically, I guess you could say, on my mother's side, and I'm Latino culturally, in that I was, you know, I was raised in Canada, but I was raised in the context of, let's say, Latino culture, right? My father's Polish, but, you know, I never learned how to speak Polish. I learned how to speak Spanish badly as a kid from both of my parents, because they both spoke fluent Spanish, right? And the family events and the cultural events that I was involved in there were, you know, Latin American, right? The friends that they had were all Latin Americans. And then, you know, I moved to Uruguay, and I've been living here for the last, what is it now, 19 years, right? So, you know, I absolutely would say that I am Latino. Now I'm also Polish, right? But I'm Polish only by history, right? And I'm also Canadian by birth and by citizenship. But I don't really identify very much with Canadian culture, you know?
Mm-hmm. So in a woke point of view, you shouldn't be considered a racist. You shouldn't be allowed to be considered a racist because you are partly, well, you're probably white, but that doesn't matter for these people. So you're not white. So you
If
can,
you're a Latino,
not
you're
being
not
a
white.
white person, you can't be racist, but you are accused of racism. So
Yeah,
one of those
but
contradictions.
okay, here's the thing, right? Nowadays, they kind of do this with everybody, right? Because you'll see like Black people, you know, Winsome Sears, who just became Lieutenant Governor of Virginia, she's a Black woman, right? And she's a Republican, right? But she's very definitely a Black woman, right? But she has been accused of being part of white supremacy, right?
Okay.
And so I have a lot of other Black people, men and women, who happen to be Republican or who happen to speak up against wokeness, right? They're actually secretly white supremacists, right? And they're not really Black anymore, right? But it used to be that they didn't do that, but they always with Latinos had a very particular quality, what I called Schrodinger's Caucasian, right? In that with woke people or with SJWs, with respect to Latinos count as white when it's useful to SJWs to count them as white, or they count as non-white when it's useful to count them as non-white, right? So you are either white or not white, depending on what is practical to them, right? So, you know, if a Latino man shoots a black man and kills him in some kind of an argument, then they're going to say a white man shot this poor black man in an argument, right? But if a Latino man gets denied entry into a store because he's, you know, because of his, whether or not it's because of his race or because of whatever, right? They're going to say this Latino man was stopped from entering this white-owned store. so like it was, that's always been how they've used that, right? Except that nowadays they say this Latinx person with a penis tried to go into the store, wasn't allowed in.
I remember last year, sorry, I think it was last year, that Antonio Banderas won some prize, probably in the UK, and the Guardian was celebrating because a man of color had
Person
won.
of color.
A person of color, and I was like, Antonio Banderas is white.
Yeah, but if it hadn't been useful for them, they would have said, well, you know what? Antonio Banderas may be Latino, but he's white presenting, right? So he's not really a person of color, you know, like the same, it could be the same person literally in two different circumstances that they would invent two different things. But I think that the Latinos are sort of, they're a very big problem for the cultural Marxist, you know, intersectionalist thinkers, because it's a very clear challenge to a lot of their fundamental racial arguments, right? Latinos are, some of them are absolutely black, all the way up to blonde-haired, blue-eyed white, right? But they're all Latinos, right? They all have a common culture, and it proves the lie to this idea that skin color is the most important determinant, right? Like that it's something that is, that also that skin color brings with it specific traits that are immutable and unchangeable, and that someone who isn't of that color cannot end up ever fully and profoundly relating to someone who is, right? So like all of these arguments that they're doing to try to kind of bring back racial division and segregation, they end up falling apart in the face of Latinos, because all Latinos know this. Like every Latino knows that, you know, there are Latinos that are brown skinned, Latinos that are dark brown skinned, Latinos that are white, Latinos that are black, and they're all Latinos. You know, Diego Forlan, the Uruguayan football player, he's blonde haired and he's a Latino, you know. This is, so this is something that for them ends up being a real big obstacle, because, you know, no Latino actually buys this bullshit, right? Like the ones that pretend they do are doing it because they're actually old school communists, and this is the closest that they get to their philosophy, you know.
Yeah, it's cultural, it's not racial, being a Latino.
Yeah, it is. It's a Latino is a cultural trait. I mean, there are Asian Latinos, right? One of my good friends here is Zhang Wong Kim, who was also a game designer. He did some product work on Shadowrun. The only other Uruguayan I know of that was published in an English language RPG, and he's, you know, he's of Korean descent, right? But he's a Latino. You know?
And in Brazil,
So-
there are lots of Japanese also.
Yes.
Yeah, of course, and in Peru, you know, and Chinese Latinos, you know, and there are Jewish Latinos, you know, so it's also not a religious classification, you know, like it's a culture, right?
Yeah.
And culture is always, you know, so in a way, Latinos are, I think, even beyond the Anglosphere, which is a type of triumph of Western liberalism, the real triumph of the Western liberal ideal of this notion of equality, meritocracy, and of the idea that essentially ideas and values and merit matter more than skin color. Latinos are the proof of that, right? Which is not to say that there aren't social problems in Latino cultures. There are. A lot of those problems are actually problems of class, right? Sometimes some of those problems in specific countries can also include elements of race, of course, right? Like in parts where there are conflicts between Latinos that are of indigenous descent versus Latinos that aren't, or in some places where there are Latinos of Black descent versus ones that aren't, or what have you. That does sometimes happen, right? But it is very peripheral to the overall quality of Latino culture, that Latino is being part of the culture. It's not being a specific blood type,
So you agree with the old left, class is more important than the rest?
Well, I agree that class
With just
is more
this
important
part.
than race. Well,
Just this part.
I very much believe in a lot of the premises that Marx had about class structure. I completely disagree with his proposed solutions to the problem, right? But there's undoubtedly, one of the things Marx points out a lot is about the toxicity of the bourgeoisie, of the middle class, right? And that the educated middle class is the biggest oppressor of the proletariat, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is absolutely true. And
It is
in fact,
happening right now.
if you cast Raised Dead on Karl Marx, and that was a stupid thing to do, but let's say you did, and he came back and you showed him, the Alejandro Ocasio-Cortez school of democratic socialism, he would immediately recognize and say that is actually a bourgeois subversion of the revolution, right? That's a middle class people who are taking over and claiming ownership over the cause of the proletariat in order to subvert the revolution to their own means, to maintain their own power as a political class, right? And that would absolutely be a correct analysis that Marx would say, right? So, there's a lot about that. That's genuine. I'm an anti-establishment person, and establishment is tied with class, right? And so there are elements of class that are much more, the argument about race is a stupid argument, right? Because nobody decides how they're born, right? Nobody decides what their skin color is, right? The argument of class is part of society and something that can be worked upon, right? There is no way to work upon any problem of race except to say race doesn't matter, and to do as much as possible to make race not matter, right? Which is to say that nobody should care about race, about what race anyone is. You should care about merit. The answer to that is to the race problem is meritocracy, right? But class is a trickier thing because it involves, the structures of an establishment and how much that establishment allows people to progress within, to climb socially or not, how much opportunity for advancement there is. And it involves the question of who holds power and what kind of power they get to hold over people,
Okay, so going back to RPGs before you close this, because it's getting a bit too late here. OSR, there's I think that there's the idea that you dislike all games that aren't OSR. Is that true or not? Do you like other games that aren't OSR?
No, it's not true. I really do like the OSR a lot because I've always been a fan of D&D. I've always believed D&D can do a lot more than what it was made to do by its original creators, or than what it was made to do by the companies that have since owned it, right? Like, one of the things I love about the OSR is how experimental it is, and it's experimental in an interesting way, right? Like it's like with art, right? There's nothing, you can call it experimental art to smash a toilet and then put all the pieces of toilet on a pedestal and say, this is art, right? But that's not interesting. That's not, that's just pretentious. That doesn't actually do anything new or anything special. That's just the way an untalented person draws attention to themselves, right? And so a lot of indie games feel like that to me. They feel like untalented people trying to use this is art as an excuse to make people think that they're clever, and they're not really. But what's really clever is when you get some kind of art or creative process that has rules, and you have these strict rules, and you say, these are the rules. Inside that box of the rules, you can do anything you want, right? And see what you can do with that, right? So when you get a creative system where there's a set of immutable rules, and then everything else is up for grabs, the creativity that generates is more, and it produces better product than a creative system that says there are no rules, do whatever you want, right? It seems strange, it seems counterintuitive, but if you say, you know, how many variations can you make from this base, this base foundation? The foundation has to be the same. What can you build? People will be more creative in what they build around within that rule, and you'll get more interesting permutations than you will if you have no base to begin with and people just do whatever comes into their head, right? It challenges you, and if the base is solid, which the D&D base is solid, it produces really great stuff. But there's a lot of other RPGs that have produced really great stuff over the years that didn't work from that base, you know, and I've played a ton of RPGs that were not OSR games or D&D, and I've even written a couple that were not OSR games or D&D, right? So, you know, I'm not exclusively an OSR guy, nor am I necessarily exclusively an OSR guy now, even though right now at this moment, I'm only playing campaigns that are OSR games, but that hasn't always been the rule, and it probably won't be in the future.
Okay, so this was a very interesting interview. We could go
Yes.
on for a couple of more hours, but we'll probably
Yeah.
die. So,
Not die, but we'll fall asleep. Not that the
Well,
conversation is boring. Yeah, but
we would die tomorrow, probably.
yes.
Thank you very much for having me, and well, let me know when this is out so I can promote it.
Sure.
Okay.
Well, tomorrow I'll take care of that. Thank you
Okay.
for coming, and we'll meet again in social media very soon.
Bye.
All right.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.